Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to those of you who may be on the West Coast. Welcome to the Queen's International Institute on Social Policy. This is the 25th annual Queen's International Institute on Social Policy. But at no time over the last 2.5 decades has it seemed that social policy has been so critical to our future, so much in debate, and so important to the directions we choose for our country in the days and weeks to come. The pandemic crisis has exposed stark inequalities in Canada. None of these inequalities were particularly new, but the pressures generated by COVID has brought them into stark relief. It's laid bare many of our fault lines and limitations in our social contract. So the purpose of the 2020 Queen's International Institute on Social Policy is to ask how Canada and OECD countries generally can rethink their social contract, can rethink the basic building blocks on which they set their social programs in place, to ask whether it's possible in this context to build back better. Now, I want to begin by noting or acknowledging that although we are not able to meet at Queen's University as we have done for 24 years in the past, I would like to acknowledge that Queen's University is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. We are grateful to be able to live and learn on their lands. Today begins the third week of our moderated sessions. In week one, we got a very broad overview of the COVID world through a keynote, a wonderful keynote, through sessions with the OECD and Canadians, and by looking at the Canadians who are vulnerable, who are at risk of being left behind. In the second week, we drilled down into 3 areas of critical public policy exposed by the pressures of the pandemic: income security, social care, including long-term care and childcare, and labor market protections. And in each of these areas, lots of ideas emerged for building back better. Lots of ideas emerged about how we could improve the program structure that we have in place, that was in place when we began, when we entered the COVID period. This week, we turn to the obvious question: what are the prospects for actually acting? What are the prospects for actually moving forward? And what are the preconditions which would have to be in place for us to be able to do that? And today we start that question with the quintessential Canadian version of the question, which is COVID and federal-provincial relations. What are the federal-provincial relations preconditions of being able to move forward to build back better? Now, we know that COVID has generated massive pressures on health and social services at both the federal and provincial levels. We also know that there are calls for improving our existing standards, as we have seen in recent weeks. And so there's a risk of major fiscal problems. We have already fiscal deficits of massive, what seem to be, by recent standards at least, massive proportions. And these are built on top of pre-existing challenges or tensions in our fiscal relations around things like equalization and shocks to energy-dependent provincial economies. As a result, we actually face questions about the robustness of our federal-provincial fiscal relations and about their capacity to sustain a process of building back better. Today's session will be moderated by Jennifer Robson. Jennifer is, Associate Professor of Political Management at Kruger College, Carleton University, where she teaches courses in public policy and research methods. Prior to coming to Carleton, Jennifer worked in the Government of Canada and worked for a number of years in the community sector, in the nonprofit sector, where she played senior roles in policy development and research. Those of you who have been paying particular attention to our series over the last 2 weeks will remember that Jennifer's name has come up a number of times as people have referred to her critical and innovative ideas about how programs get managed in this country. So we're in very good hands with Jennifer. So please welcome Jennifer Robson, who will introduce our speakers. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Keith. That was a very kind and very warm welcome, and I'm delighted to be here and part of this panel and part of the conference. This is a panel discussion on rethinking fiscal arrangements in Canada. The focus for this session is on the future of Canada's fiscal arrangements in the COVID era. The pandemic has generated massive pressures on health, social services. It's accelerated government deficits at all orders of government, and all while there are growing public calls for inclusion and better social protection in public services, from long-term care through to employment insurance. There's a risk of untenable fiscal imbalances in the Federation on top of other economic and political frictions that predated the current public health crisis. So how robust are Canada's current fiscal arrangements, and what does it mean for fiscal federalism to, quote, build back better? We have two terrific presenters to join us today, but before I introduce them, let me go over a few housekeeping items. After the presentations, I'll be opening the floor for moderated questions. To ask a question, please use the webinar's Q&A feature and type your question in at any time. You'll see this feature, that Q&A feature, at the bottom of your screen. Due to time constraints, we might not be able to respond to all of the questions that are raised, but we will do our very best by, for example, grouping questions or consolidating them as much as possible. Now let me begin by introducing our speakers. We are delighted to have two experts with us on fiscal arrangements. Let me introduce Robin Bodway. He's Emeritus Professor in the Department of Economics at Queen's University. He's had a long and distinguished career. Dr. Bodway's extensive research has supported royal commissions and shaped the national and international discussion on tax policy, redistribution, and fiscal federalism. Daniel Belin is the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. He is the author, I think, of more publications in a given year than most of us are actually able to read. His most recent books are How Ideas and Institutions Shape the Politics of Public Policy, and, as co-editor, Universality and Social Policy in Canada. We'll begin with the presentation from Robin, followed by the presentation by Danielle, and then we'll get to a discussion and responses to your questions from the audience. So please make sure to type those questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Robin, can I invite you to begin your presentation?
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you, Keith, and thank you for the organizers of this conference for inviting me to talk about this important and timely issue. I propose to touch on three areas. First, review some of the key issues with the existing fiscal arrangements pre-pandemic, then talk briefly about the fallout from the pandemic itself, and then focus a bit on the policy options as I see it, beginning with the issues. I think that there are four overriding issues with the federal-provincial fiscal relations. One is a growing vertical fiscal imbalance, reflected in a number of things. One is a large provincial debt to GDP ratios and growing, comparable to the federal. Another is the fact that provincial social spending is growing at a relatively higher rate than federal transfers to the provinces, which implies that the fiscal imbalance is increasing. Another is the fact that the provinces are facing particular demographic pressures that influence both their expenditure needs and their revenue raising abilities. And in addition, the municipalities are increasingly constrained. In weighing how to address these issues of fiscal imbalance, it's worth reminding ourselves of the trade-offs that are involved. There are advantages of sizable federal provincial fiscal transfers. One of them is the federal leadership in revenue raising and social insurance, as well as risk sharing, to be balanced against the advantages of social program decentralization from an efficiency point of view. And as ever, the larger is the vertical imbalance, the more do the provinces rely on federal transfers, the greater are the dangers of a self-budget constraint. The second issue is a continuing horizontal imbalance, which has been a feature of the Canadian Federation forever. There are sizable fiscal capacity differences across provinces that are reflected in different provincial debt to GDP ratios, different provincial growth rates, different provincial demographic pressures, and in the case of some provinces, immense pressures on natural resource revenues. There are also a lot of shortcomings of the existing equalization system, including structural issues, the binding GDP cap on the growth of equalization, the partial treatment of resource revenues, the fact that the growing source of revenues from carbon taxes is not incorporated properly into the equalization system, and also the fact that the equalization system focuses only on the revenue side of provinces and not on their expenditure needs. Equalization is inadequate as an insurer of risk to the provinces, and I'll return to that momentarily. But I also should mention that the system of per capita transfers in support of social programs from the federal governments to the provinces is in fact a very effective system at equalization, both equalizing the have provinces down and the have not provinces up. The horizontal imbalance in turn brings with it fiscal competition pressures leading to bigger than neighbor protective measures that provinces are prone to undertake. A third area of concern is the inadequacy of fiscal stabilization, which has been particularly pronounced recently as resource prices have tanked and we've faced a pandemic shock. Provinces are prone to idiosyncratic fiscal shocks. They have limited ability to self-insure, with the possible exception of resource-rich provinces who could, if they wanted, self-insure, but who have chosen not to. The federal government is in a position to pool risks across provinces and across time, but they haven't done it. Their existing stabilization programs are not very effective. The equalization program is not very stabilizing, mainly because equalization transfers vary with average revenue capacity of the provinces, which itself varies with shocks. The fiscal stabilization program, which is intended to be a risk-sharing device for the provinces, has well-known inadequacies. Its limit on 60% per capita payments to the provinces has not changed for decades and is declining in real terms. And the resource revenues are only stabilized to a maximum of 50%. And then what I think would be the fourth issue would be the state of coordination or non-coordination of responsibility between the provinces and the federal government and among the provinces. Federal provincial harmonization has tended to be done on a case-by-case basis. There have been some good stories and some less good ones. Tax harmonization has been a relatively successful story, but remains incomplete on the sales tax side. Harmonization of environmental pricing policies is missing. Diverse carbon pricing regimes exist across provinces, as do regulatory approaches. There's been considerable progress on the internal common market with the Canada Free Trade Agreement and various bilateral agreements between the federal government and the provinces and among the provinces. Capital market regulation is a work in progress. Most importantly, for the purposes of this conference, I think that there's been an unconscionable lack of coordination in the area of social safety net and social protection, lack of coordination between social insurance, income security, tax transfers, and social assistance, all of which are divided between the federal government and the provinces. And there's been limited coordination among the provinces in areas of exclusive provincial jurisdiction. The pandemic shock exposed some of the weakness of the existing fiscal arrangements. And let me focus on two areas here. First of all, the fiscal and economic fallout. The main fallout was a once-over increase in both federal and provincial debt, as well as an increase in private indebtedness and bankruptcies. The vulnerabilities of the social protection system was particularly exposed, the inadequacy of the employment insurance system and of income support for the working poor and those who have precarious jobs. We're very familiar with the the vulnerability of the long-term care system and childcare, as well as public health preparedness. The temporary job losses that resulted from the shutdown in response to the pandemic were concentrated among low-wage service sector workers and those unable to work from home. High-income earners were, relatively speaking, sheltered. Secondly, the pandemic had an enormous intergenerational impact. That is to say, its cost is or will be spread unevenly across generations. There are immediate costs to the younger generations: loss of educational opportunities, disadvantages arising from delayed entry into the job market. Generally speaking, capital income has been better protected than labor, especially capital income generated from equity markets. And this has tended to favor the well-off elderly. There's a potential for current younger generations to suffer as the pandemic costs are paid down in the future, and older generations are spared the costs of financing the pandemic debt. So, given these observations about the current fiscal arrangements and the effects of the pandemic shock, what policy options can we envisage for making the fiscal arrangements more resilient and resistant to shock? First of all, we might consider a number of fiscal reforms in the system. The first of which I think addresses what I think is a big problem with the pandemic shock, and that is its intergenerational impact. One thing we could do is try and spread the cost of the pandemic debt across generations by paying the debt off gradually to spread the burden to the future, and by looking for ways to spread the costs of the pandemic to older generation, which is a little more difficult. The only way that I can think of doing that is to engage in tax reforms that would, for example, broaden the income tax base by including more capital income in the tax base, or more dramatically consider a once-over wealth tax, sometimes referred to as a PGU wealth tax, to cover the temporary costs of the pandemic. Secondly, reallocate debt from the provinces to the federal government, possibly by a once-over transfer from the federal government to the provinces. Reform fiscal transfers, end the cap on equalization so that equalization is better equipped to deal with horizontal fiscal imbalances. Tie the growth of social transfers to provincial program expenditures so that the vertical balance doesn't worsen automatically over time, and enhance the fiscal stabilization program so that the federal government can more properly provide a form of insurance to the provinces when they're faced with idiosyncratic shocks. There are also potential new spending power initiatives that I put in brackets with a question mark, because these are obviously matters of negotiation between the federal government and the provinces, but things that come to mind include reforming the long-term healthcare system, reforming childcare provision, and introducing a pharmacare system. Then I think of some policy options that are more of a structural basis. And the first one has to do with reallocating expenditure responsibilities. At the moment, the responsibility for transfers to low-income people is divided between the federal government and the provinces. The provinces make social assistance payments to the non-working poor. Federal government provides assistance to the temporarily unemployed, to the elderly, and to children. And it seems to me to make sense to, I say make social assistance federal, but what I really mean is make the federal government responsible for transfers to low-income people. One way to do this would be to use the federal income tax system as a prime method for delivering transfers to individuals. One way of doing this would be to create a federal provincial basic income guarantee delivered through the income tax system, with the federal government taking the lead. Secondly, change the vertical balance so that the provinces are less reliant on their own revenues and less vulnerable to shocks to those revenues, by increasing the federal tax room and compensating that by increasing the level of social transfers to the provinces. This would make the provinces less vulnerable and preserve tax harmonization. And then not so much a fiscal federalism issue, but in fact, a federal provincial harmonization issue would be to pursue a major tax reform to improve both the fairness of the tax system and the incentives of businesses to innovate and invest. At the basis of that would be a basic income guarantee and a broadening of the capital income tax base to make the income tax fairer for all. Think about reinstating an inheritance tax so that inequality is not passed from generation to generation, and reform the corporate income tax to encourage investment and to reduce the incentive for corporations to accumulate debt finance and make themselves more vulnerable to shocks. Then I think we could think about institutional reforms that would enable the federal and provincial governments to become more cooperative and have less of a tendency to conduct their responsibilities in independent silos. And I think it's worth exploring some institutional mechanisms for fostering coordination and harmonization. One relatively simple way, I think, would be to expand the Council of the Federation to include the federal government, so that they would be at the table when there are discussions about federal-provincial fiscal relations. A second might be to introduce a new institution like a fiscal council to monitor federal and provincial situations, so that federal-provincial fiscal arrangements are taken out of the budgetary process and put on a more long-term basis, or perhaps more limitedly to create a grants council to advise on federal-provincial transfers in the future. Those are quite ambitious things to do, but I think in light of the vulnerabilities that have been exposed by the pandemic, I think it's worth putting these things on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. That was a terrific and wide-ranging presentation with many really thought-provoking policy ideas and prescriptions in there. Now I'm going to turn to Daniel Bellin, who will give his presentation, followed by our discussion. Daniel, can I invite you to begin?
Hello, thank you very much for this this invitation, and thank you to of course Keith Banting. Thank you to Jennifer and Robin for his excellent presentation. I hope that you can see my my screen. I have screen sharing here, and if there is any problem, of course we can use an alternative way to show the slides. And so today I will talk about the politics of fiscal federalism in Canada. I will discuss some of the issues raised by Robin in his excellent presentation. There is some coordination between the two of us here in terms of who's talking about what. Obviously, he's an economist, so he focuses on economic and policy issues. I will focus on the political side of fiscal federalism, which is something I'm very much interested in. So today I will first talk about, well, federalism and social policy from a fiscal standpoint, and I will discuss Keith Banting's typology of social programs as they relate to federalism. Then I will discuss the political situation in the field of fiscal federalism before COVID-19. Then I will turn to the political effects of COVID-19 on fiscal federalism. Then I will ask whether this is really, whether COVID, the pandemic is really a critical juncture in fiscal federalism. And if I have time, I will talk about the current Liberal minority government, and also how we might improve governance in fiscal federalism. So here we have a typology that Keith Banting developed in a chapter published in 2005, really about types of social policies as they relate to federalism. And there are three types of social programs that he discusses in the chapter, and I thought it would be an interesting way to connect fiscal federalism and and social policy here. So first of all, he talks about classical federalism, which is about how social programs operated either by Ottawa or the provinces. So when social programs are operated independently in their own jurisdiction. And so that is what is known as classical federalism. Shared cost federalism, which is what we'll focus on today, is when the federal government offers fiscal support to provinces under specific terms to help them run their own programs. So this typology by Keith Banting, I think, is very useful as a starting point. And so classical federalism, again, the provinces or Ottawa will run their own programs, like EI is a purely federal program, or the provinces will run specific programs that don't receive any federal funding. So it's really a separation between the two orders of government in terms of fiscal federalism. When we talk about shared cost federalism, and we have these examples I will talk about later, but certainly the case when we talk about Medicare, for example, you have here provinces receiving federal supports from Ottawa under specific terms, so with often strings attached. And then joint decision federalism, which is really common in some other countries like Germany, is much less common in Canadian social policy. And the key example here will be the Canada Pension Plan, where really the provinces have a veto point over the reform of a specific national program. Well, in the case of the Canada Pension Plan, it's all of Canada except Quebec. And we won't talk much about joint decision federalism, but joint decision federalism can be a source of really thoughts about how we can move forward in improving social policy reform and even fiscal federalism in Canada. And I point here to recent work by Caroline Tuohy on long-term care published in Policy Options. But today I will focus on shared cost federalism, and of course the three main pillars of shared cost federalism. So the Canada Health Transfer, by far the largest and most vital transfer for the provinces. It's twice as big as equalization, and even much bigger than the Canada Social Transfer. So very large per capita on a per capita basis, and it's an area where politically provinces can really band together and really pressure the federal government. It's not so it's easy for the provinces to agree on the need to increase federal health care transfers, so to beef up the Canada Health Transfer. At the same time, premiers have adopted different strategies dealing with provincial pressures in the area, because the needs are very, very important in the provinces. We saw what happened under Paul Martin in 2004 with this 10-year health accord. But under Stephen Harper, there was unilateralism, and under Trudeau, a divide and conquest strategy. So different approaches to deal with the provinces when they seek more money from Ottawa. Right now, there is actually an economic summit, Ontario-Quebec Economic Summit, and Doug Ford and François Legault are discussing issues of fiscal federalism, including how to pressure Ottawa to increase the Canada Health Transfer. And we'll see that playing out later this month in Quebec City at the next meeting of the Council of the Federation. And obviously, provinces and territories will certainly mobilize very strongly to ask for more money, especially in regarding the CHT. When we talk about the Canada Social Transfer, it has even fewer strings attached than the Canada Health Transfer. In the case of the CHT, it's of course the Canada Health Act, these 5 principles that are so central here. But for the CST, apart from a residency criteria regarding social assistance, relatively few strings attached. And it's quite heterogeneous as a transfer. And I think it's a different political game. It's more fragmented than when we talk about the Canada Health Transfer. Equalization policy, of course, is much more divisive because it's a zero-sum game. So instead of allocating money on a per capita basis like CST and CHT, well, only some provinces receive equalization, 5 of them right now. And we've heard a lot of criticisms towards the equalization program from non-receiving provinces in recent years, especially Alberta and Saskatchewan. Now, interestingly, while equalization is more controversial, at least among provinces than CHT is, which is a much bigger program, equalization is the only pillar of shared cost federalism that's actually constitutionalized. That's embedded in subsection 36(2) of the Constitutional Act 1982. But it's only, I would say, equalization, the idea of equalization as a broad principle that's embedded in the Constitutional Act 1982, not how the actual formula works. And as Robin said earlier, there are a lot of issues with equalization and things that could be changed about the program, including removing the cap and dealing with carbon pricing and many other issues. So it's a pretty contentious topic, and the provinces can't see eye to eye on this because they are divided by the fact that some of them do receive payments and others don't. Of course, the identity of the provinces receiving these payments changes over time, and that is also altering the politics of equalization policy. The situation before COVID-19, I will go really fast on this. Fiscal federalism was already a big issue before COVID-19. Grievances about equalization were really clearly formulated in Saskatchewan, especially Alberta, and it's still on the table, this provincial referendum on equalization that Alberta Premier Jason Kenney will actually trigger if he doesn't get what he wants in terms of reforms of fiscal federalism. Clearly, after the 2019, the October 2019 federal elections, there was a lot of concern in Canada about regional alienation, especially the situation prevailing out west in Alberta and Saskatchewan, provinces that have 0 Liberal MP. And that certainly affected the politics of fiscal federalism. Chrystia Freeland became Minister of Intergovernmental Relations after the federal elections, and she tried, and she was quite successful in diffusing some of the tensions between Ottawa and both Alberta and Saskatchewan. The provinces, on the other hand, asked for really changes to the fiscal stabilization program, which is very modest in scope, and that Robin talked about in his presentation. And the provinces were asking and are still asking for more CHT money. So clearly, when we talk about the political effects of COVID-19, the good news in terms of national unity is that, and intergovernmental relations, is that the provinces, the territories, the federal government really came together during this crisis. The level of intergovernmental, I think, conflict declined quite rapidly. The federal government launched a lot of emergency programs that have helped Canadians all across the country from coast to coast to coast. But this kind of harmony or relative peace in intergovernmental relations is something temporary, obviously. And as I mentioned earlier, there are still major grievances about key issues in fiscal federalism, like fiscal stabilization and, of course, equalization, which is something that should remain a contentious issue moving forward. Another effect of COVID-19, of course, is also to increasing the SAIC in terms of public debt and deficits in both Ottawa and the provinces. And clearly, the provinces are pushing very hard to get more federal funding. And so far, the Trudeau government has responded to these demands. They are, of course, facing a minority parliament. And so it's a situation where it's quite likely that they will like to appease the provinces and spend more. And the big spending agenda is something that people anticipate at the throne speech later this month. and that is a very important issue that should also have an impact on the politics of fiscal federalism. Now, are we at a critical juncture? We published an article with 3 colleagues, André Lecourt, Mireille Paquette, and Trevor Toom in the Canadian Journal of Political Science about this issue of whether COVID-19 will actually lead to major changes in the way fiscal federalism is organized in this country. Frankly, it's too early to tell. There are major changes happening in the provinces at the federal level in terms of spending, but whether this will actually lead to reevaluation and major changes to the 3 transfers I mentioned earlier, including and especially equalization and also fiscal stabilization. I think it's too early to tell. It will depend on intergovernmental dynamics, what's happening in Parliament in this context of minority government, liberal minority government, with the NDP pushing for more spending, including in areas of provincial jurisdiction. And finally, it will depend on how long this crisis lasts. The longer it lasts, and the deeper the negative economic and fiscal consequences are, the more likely we will see bolder initiatives in terms of reforming fiscal federalism in this country. But as we know, institutions program are sticky. There are powerful vested interests at stake. And that's true when we talk about CHT, or equalization, although these vested interests varies quite significantly from one type of program to the next. Now, potential political drivers of political change, I already mentioned minority government, which creates quite a bit of instability. And there is this big spending agenda that people are talking about. We'll see how it actually materializes, and if the Trudeau government can survive and implement part of this possible agenda, which will have important ramifications could have important ramifications for fiscal federalism. The provincial governments, I think, are really facing major challenges, and they have a very strong incentive to band together and ask more money from Ottawa in areas where they can actually agree on what to do. And again, equalization is not one of these areas. It's an area of contention among the provinces for obvious reasons. And we'll see whether we'll have additional federal support for childcare, for long-term care, which are central issues during this pandemic. I think it's something that also I've been writing about with some other colleagues. It's not just about money, it's about how the pandemic is altering the policy agenda in this country, how the pandemic is really reshaping issues that are central to policy debates. And certainly right now in the pandemic, we talk even more about childcare than before. And for long-term care, it's even more and more and more because of what happened in provinces like Quebec and Ontario and elsewhere during COVID-19. I think the major flaws of long-term care policy are obvious, and there is I think a clear fiscal federalism component to this issue, and we will hear more about this moving forward. So the pandemic is affecting the political struggle in terms of the needs, the fiscal needs that are even greater than before, changing political strategies, but also changing in some ways, or altering the topics, the issues that we discuss on the policy agenda. And that's something very important for fiscal federalism. In terms of fiscal federalism, we really need to improve governance of fiscal federalism. Certainly, we are working with some colleagues, and we published a manifesto for that in Policy Options earlier this year, with Bev Dalby, Steve Orsini, and several others. And we are working to put together a non-governmental commission. Won't be a permanent commission, a temporary commission, to examine different issues in fiscal federalism, including the municipal side of fiscal federalism, which is very contentious. And it's something that we don't talk about as much. And I think that when we talk about fiscal federalism, I know provinces, they don't necessarily want to talk about this at the national level because they want to control things, but it's certainly a key issue. We cannot ignore, just because of the constitutional design of our country, and that municipalities are perceived as, or are creatures of the provinces, we should not leave municipalities out of the discussion, especially big cities, out of the discussion about the future of federalism in this country. And I think this is something that we want to tackle with this commission, to bring the municipalities to the fore alongside provinces, territories, and of course the federal government. Before I end, of course, another issue that I've published about with some other colleagues, including André Lecourt, and in our book with also Greg Marchildon, Hai-Jun Mu, and Rose Alford, our book on equalization published 2017, is the idea of a permanent arm's length body that would advise the federal government on equalization and other transfer payments. The idea of this permanent independent commission, arm's length commission, comes from Australia, but other countries like India have similar commissions, and that will be a way perhaps to reduce some of the political tensions over fiscal policy. You cannot remove it all. Money is inherently political. It's so important, but and you cannot avoid political conflict over it. But certainly having just the feds and the government in power in Ottawa really deciding the future of all these transfers, especially equalization, unilaterally, is certainly a challenge. And we have in our book and in other publications put forward, like following other scholars, the idea that we really need to think about the governance of equalization, and I would say fiscal federalism more generally, when this crisis is over. Maybe not, it's not, we have more pressing issues to deal with right now, but let's think also not just about the short term, but also about long-term solutions when we deal with the all contentious politics of fiscal federalism in this country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. That was another wonderful presentation. Lots and lots and lots for us to talk about. Can I ask both Daniel and Robin to turn their cameras on, and we're going to move to the Q&A portion of the session. We've been getting a number of questions from the audience already, so I do encourage listeners, viewers to continue typing those questions in, please. I want to start off with a question about the uncertainty, though. You know, I think you both gave very compelling diagnoses of both sort of where we currently are and some of the issues to pay attention to in terms of fiscal arrangements looking ahead, as well, you know, on the policy as well as the politics of this. But we're in a public health crisis and an economic crisis with very little certainty on the path forward for either of those types of crises right now. So how should policymakers be handling that degree of uncertainty? Robin, can I ask you to begin and Danielle to follow?
Well, that's a tough question. Uncertainty comes in a wide variety of ways. It comes in the form of uncertainty in terms of job retention. It comes in uncertainty in incomes at the individual level. It comes in uncertainty for businesses and their possibility of going bankrupt. And I think we need to have the full range of insurance options in place. The federal government seems to have taken on the role of social insurance for individuals, especially through the employment insurance system. And there are obvious shortcomings of the employment insurance system that have to be addressed, including especially its coverage. But there's also, I think, a problem that in the fiscal federalism context that the provinces and their municipalities, for that matter, face in terms of not being able to self-insure and respond to shocks that they're faced with. And I think that it's important for us to revisit the fiscal stabilization program and make sure that the federal government is exercising its ability to pool shocks over provincial for the provincial governments in a way that at the same time doesn't encourage provinces to take advantage of the situation. And that's sort of the trade-off, is how do you design a sort of a fiscal stabilization program along insurance principles in a way that doesn't encourage soft budget constraints and moral hazard problems.
Danielle, I saw you nodding along to much of what Robin was saying there. What are your thoughts on this
Yes.
same question of uncertainty?
Well, there are two things. The first of all, about fiscal stabilization. The good thing in a way is that we have been talking about that since last year. So even before the COVID-19 crisis hit Canada, we're already discussing some of the flaws of fiscal stabilization in this country. Some experts have published about this, like Bev Dalby and Trevor Toomb and others, already thinking about what we should do to improve the system, which is grossly inadequate. And that was quite clear and problematic. It was clear before the COVID-19 crisis occurred, and I think it's even more the case today. But it's a huge political challenge, I think, for the federal government, and it might be very expensive to actually fix fiscal stabilization, and they have a lot of spending priorities as far as I understand. So it is not just a fiscal challenge, but a political challenge. Beyond that, uncertainty is not always a bad thing, in the sense that it can also force us to think beyond the status quo and imagine new policy alternatives. There are people who have written about that, like Mark Blyth, political scientist, writing about how uncertainty during crisis can pave the way to positive policy change. Well, the policy change could also be negative for that matter, but certainly uncertainty is one of the ingredients in a good recipe for policy change. So although it's hard to live with the anxiety, it also sometimes forces us to think outside the box and imagine new policy solutions beyond the status quo, when the status quo is itself a source of anxiety, a source of uncertainty in changing times.
You both spoke in your presentations about the need for better governance and had, I think, slightly different perspectives in terms of what you would recommend. But I want to go to a question from some of the viewers. If the federal government were to join the table at the Council of the Federation, wouldn't that create an impetus for provinces? So if we went with that as the governance mechanism, wouldn't that just create an impetus or a reason for provinces to create their own separate body yet again, so that they could coordinate amongst themselves, leaving out the federal government? So, would we be essentially recreating the same problem that we've had with existing mechanisms? So, how do we respond to that? Danielle, maybe I can ask you to start this time, followed by Robin.
No, I think it's a good point. Obviously, it's good from a political standpoint for the provinces, the territories, the premiers to get together and think about what they will ask the federal government, but also how they can coordinate their efforts in an autonomous way from the federal government. So not having the federal government around the table sometimes can actually be an asset, right? You can do things together and you don't need Ottawa to get involved, or you can think about how you will pressure Ottawa, how you can forge coalitions and maybe avoid some divide and conquest strategy, avoid to fall in the trap of divide and conquest strategies on the part of the federal government. So I think that maybe that people have been critical of the Council of the Federation, maybe not as effective as the founders of this body imagined, but still, I think that politically it serves a purpose, and not having the feds around the table at, for example, the meeting that's coming up in Quebec City has advantages for the provinces and territories.
Robin, can I ask you to respond to the same question, and maybe also talk a bit about your views on why the existing mechanisms that we've had for coordination have not been as effective, both vertically as well as horizontally, as you talked about in your presentation?
Well, my view is that we need more cooperation in the Federation, full stop. That too much of what's happened in the past has been based on confrontation and not cooperation. Some of the most important policy innovations since the 1950s or 60s have been the result of harmonized cooperative behavior between the federal government and the provinces. I mean, I always think of the tax harmonization agreements, tax collection agreements, as being one of the most important innovations in tax policy internationally that has been taken up in other countries. And it's, that was consciously a decision of negotiation between the federal government and the provinces. And I think the same applies in other areas. We've got so many policy areas where decisions are siloed between the federal government and the province. And I think of income security as being the most important of these, that where you divide the responsibility for income security and between the federal government and the provinces in a way that leads us to a very, very disharmonized system that doesn't serve the needs of the people that want it. Now, I understand that since there's an aggregate amount of money at stake, there's always going to be a quarrel between the federal government and the provinces. But it seems to me that it's better to have that quarrel around the table than to have it in a situation where the federal government is sitting outside and the provinces are making demands. Sorry.
No, please.
Over
finish.
to you.
Okay.
Can I respond?
Please.
Yeah, no, I agree that there is a spirit of cooperation right now because of COVID-19. I mean, the tensions are not as strong as they were just after or before the 2019 federal election. So we can surf on this to increase coordination in key policy areas. But we should not, think that the conflict, intergovernmental conflict, it's all over and the provinces will just, that infighting won't continue or re-emerge. I think it's just the nature of our federal system, and we have to find a way to, yes, create areas of synergy and cooperation, but also understand that fiscal federalism will remain inherently political, and therefore conflict cannot be eliminated altogether.
Let me pursue this line a little bit. This is another question from one of the audience members. Let's imagine a scenario that is perhaps actually not unimaginable, given the current context. If or indeed when a province defaults on their debt, will the federal government have to step in? And given this current peace and harmony intergovernmentally, is that kind of shock something that the Federation would be able to sustain, both in terms of fiscal arrangements and policy terms, but also the politics of that? Robin, can I ask you to respond?
Well, we're talking hypotheticals here to a certain extent, but I think if we want to go in that direction, we probably should recognize the fact that capital markets would probably anticipate that if a province was on the verge of going bankrupt, that the federal government wouldn't let that happen, would come in and bail it out. And I don't see any way of avoiding that scenario as long as we're using the common currency, and bankruptcy in one province is going to have enormous spillovers in the rest of the country. So what we really want to do is set up institutions that, in some sense, avoid the prospects of a province going bankrupt, which to me involves maybe setting up institutions that monitor provincial finances and federal finances in a way that warns us of problems coming in the future. It's not always possible to deal with them. We've certainly had instances in the past, in the recent past, where provinces have effectively been bailed out. But I think that one of the arguments for having more the federal government and the provinces at the same table, or having an arm's length council looking at these things, is to try and at least give us warning that something like that's going to happen and do something about it in advance.
Danielle, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I think prevention here is the name of the game. We have to avoid this, and the federal government could play, of course, a major role in that. But provinces should discuss these issues, and I think that we should have a conversation in this country about this very possibility, because some provinces are facing enormous challenges. I'm thinking here about, for example, Newfoundland and Labrador. So we have to really avoid this, and we need to talk about it earlier rather than later.
Both of your presentations talked about some of the big workhorses of fiscal federalism in Canada, the transfers to provinces, equalization, stabilization. We've had a question from the audience about separate funding arrangements for special purpose programs, so special purpose transfers, like the agreement on early learning and childcare. How do you see those kinds of arrangements and agreements looking ahead? What are the pros and cons of having perhaps a more active federal government who will use more of those mechanisms rather than the existing transfer arrangements? Danielle, can I invite you to begin, and then Robin?
Yeah, I think it's a tool that that has now become, you know, it's part of the toolbox of the federal government, and I think the provinces really want money, so they have agreed to, for the most part, to participate in that you know, play that game, if you want, participate in that system. I think it's a way for the federal government to shape the social policy agenda across the country and in the provinces, and I think that will continue. And we'll see maybe what will be announced at the Trump speech and later in the next federal budget if the Liberals can win the confidence vote and stay in power. But I suspect that this this area will remain a key focus of the Liberals moving forward if they survive.
Robin, can I ask you your thoughts on these sort of bilateral agreements? I mean, we even just had $2 billion transferred for safe restart of schools, which is an area of purely provincial jurisdiction. Is this sort of the way forward, or what are the pros and cons of that?
Well, let me say two or three things. First of all, obviously, it sounds as if we're talking about things that are in provincial jurisdiction. So anything the federal government does, it can only do through the power of its purse. I assume when you're talking about bilateral arrangements, you're not talking about federal government doing bilateral relations with individual provinces, are you? Or are you talking about a general shared cost program that all provinces can participate in?
Well, it seems to me that the model has become sort of some sort of multilateral framework agreement that all provinces sign on to, but the specific arrangements are negotiated as bilateral arrangements between the federal government and provinces. And again, I mean, the models so far have been, for example, the Safe Restart Agreement, the Early Learning and Childcare Agreement from a few years ago. So it does seem to have some multilateral dimension to it, but the nuts and bolts do seem to be these bilateral arrangements between the federal and provincial governments.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think at some point we should revisit the Social Union Framework Agreement because there were some good ideas in there about how we should proceed institutionally with these sorts of things. I mean, the other thing I would say is that some of these items, childcare being an example, and I should be very careful how I get into this, but some of these items can actually be addressed at least partly through the tax system, through you know, refundable tax credits or deductions or expensing or whatnot. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that when we're talking about some of these programs that affect individuals.
Maybe that's a good point then to turn to questions around tax reform, because Robin, your presentation proposed a number of different avenues for tax reform in terms of bringing back the inheritance tax and thinking about taxation of wealth. There have been a couple of specific questions from audience members on tax reform, namely wanting to hear more about your proposals for that wealth tax, but also somebody has asked about the prospects for a Tobin tax. Is that something, so a tax on profits on owner-occupied homes as well? Are these some options that policymakers ought to be taking into account, and thinking of this from an intergenerational perspective, which I think is how you framed some of these tax reform issues in your presentation. So maybe I can invite you to talk more about those tax reform proposals, and then Danielle, I'll turn to you afterwards to talk about the politics of the intergenerational issues here. So Robin, I'll turn to you first.
Okay, bearing in mind how much time I have here, there's only a certain amount I can say. Let me just say at the very broad level that I think the main things we need in a tax reform are an enhancement of the fairness of the program, combined with changes in the business tax system to encourage innovation and investment, and to discourage firms from relying so much on debt, get them to doing real activities rather than financial ones. And also to bear in mind that one of our greatest inequalities is intergenerational and social mobility. So with those three things in mind, I mean, to me, there are a number of basic elements to do. One is to fix up the system at the bottom so that people at the bottom end are getting enough to live on, which to me means running some kind of a guaranteed income through the income tax system. A second one would be to enhance the fairness throughout the tax system by closing loopholes and in a sense broadening the base and making sure that all forms of capital income are taxed in the same way. And you mentioned, somebody mentioned in one of the questions that I saw, whether a tax on owner-occupied housing would be part of a tax reform. And my answer to that is potentially the tax on capital gains in owner-occupied housing could be a part of an expansion of the tax base of capital income. You'd have to be a little bit careful about how you did that and what kind of exemptions you had, but I think in principle, unearned capital gains on housing are legitimate things, sources of capital income that could be taxed. And the issue of an inheritance tax is a little more controversial, and I would certainly prefer an inheritance tax over an annual wealth tax for a number of reasons that we need to go into. But an inheritance tax is a tax which essentially aims to undo sort of arbitrary intergenerational benefits that some people have and others don't have, just from the accumulation of family wealth. So I think an inheritance tax, which many countries have, including the US, not all of them are effective, is something that we should investigate.
Danielle, what are the politics of the intergenerational aspects? Young people have, in many ways, borne a lot of the brunt of the COVID impacts in terms of impacts on academic pathways and trajectories, delayed entry into the labor market. You know, young people have not seen their employment recover, but there seems to be a tension, right? Or at least an ideological tension with regards to the politics of that intergenerational aspect of this, and its link back to how quickly do we have to pay down the deficit and sort of resume fiscal austerity. Could you give us your views on that landscape?
I think it's very important. First of all, I agree about redistribution and about the inheritance tax. I think it's so there are some really useful proposals that Robin is putting on the table. But regarding this intergenerational issue, I think that we need to help low-income people. We need to beef up the EI system, which is really inadequate. This is not directly about fiscal federalism, but this is something that the federal government, a program that is operated all across the country, and that has elements of territorial redistribution that are actually quite explicit with the EI regions. So I think that fixing the EI system, investing more in training and in higher education, but also really trying to empower young people and through redistribution. And taxing the rich or inheritance tax will actually could benefit young people in a way as well, because this money could be used for programs that might support them. But there are a lot of issues that are so that people want to solve, and for example, long-term care is about mainly older people, but it also, investing in long-term care helps younger people. Because if our long-term care system is bankrupt or doesn't work well, it's the children and grandchildren of these older folks who actually also pay a price because of all the sacrifices they have to make and so forth. So sometimes we have to be careful about intergenerational issues and talking about intergenerational conflict, because these, of course, exist. But at the same time, if you frame them as something that is unilateral and really simplistic, then you can actually create more political conflict, where sometimes you can have alliances among low-income people from different age groups who can have common agenda, share common agenda. So I think that certainly we need. I will think that right now the important thing is to invest in young people. The important thing is to help people who are looking for work right now, and to stimulate the economy. And that is very good for young people and frankly for the rest of us. So I will focus on that rather than an austerity agenda, which I think will have a lot of victims, including younger people who struggle and need public support.
Would it be fair to say that you are both in agreement that tax and transfer systems and redistribution ought to be on the policy agenda, and frankly may just by virtue of circumstance may well be, whether policymakers want it or not. But is it fair to say that you are both in the camp of saying that the current deficit is not something that should be causing us to light our hair on fire, that Robin, you've proposed many ways to change some of the tax base that would raise some new revenues, but I'm not hearing from either of you that that we need to immediately return to balanced budgets as quickly as we possibly can. Is that a fair characterization? Robin, why don't you begin?
Well, fundamentally, debt is an intergenerational transfer. Any deficit is an intergenerational transfer. And so from that point of view, we're already passing on to the next generation a lot of bad things, including the environment and so on, although we're also passing on a lot of innovations and new knowledge. But I think, essentially the issue of what we should do in the long run with the debt to GDP ratio is a question of how we want different generations to pay for the debt. The pandemic is a very special thing. And in some sense, what you should do is let's just isolate the debt that was increased during the pandemic and treat that somewhat differently. That's something that's a shock that shouldn't be borne by the current young generation. So that's something that we really need to spread over the future, and to the extent that we can spread it to the older generations. That's not saying that, that's not a general statement about not worrying about the debt. That's really a statement about, let's not worry about the debt that we're building up just for the purposes of this pandemic. Let's treat that as separate from the debt that we would otherwise have built up. And I think I think being vigilant about the debt that we'd already built up is not a bad idea. But paying off the pandemic debt rapidly is something that would be very costly for younger generations, I think.
Danielle, did I characterize it right?
Yeah, no, I think that certainly debt is, we should be mindful of what we are doing and think about the long-term burden we are creating. But we also have to think about tax fairness, about who pays taxes, how much, and how the tax burden is distributed. And also we have to understand that, yes, asking I think wealthier Canadians to make a greater effort is a good thing, but at some point we'll have also to make difficult choices. And if we keep spending more, we'll have to raise taxes, maybe revisit. I know politically it's really poisonous. There are issues like increasing the GST. I think it was a mistake to lower it from 7 to 5% under Stephen Harper. I'm not the only one that thinks that, but increasing it now will be a mistake right now. But in the future, we'll have to think about how we can actually raise more money, but in a way that is fair. So if you will increase the GST, you have to compensate with tax credits for low-income people and so forth to add to what we already have to shield the poor people against the negative impacts of some of these tax increases. But we'll have to think about raising more money if we want to spend more. And the problem is that if you don't think about the role of taxes in our society and the importance of raising more money, and you just say we spend and increase the debt, and then that the solution is only maybe to tax the very rich, that's not enough. At some point, people in the middle will also have to pay more if we want to afford all the new programs that actually some people want, and perhaps the current Liberal government want, and some provincial governments want. And we have, I think, to do some pedagogy about this too. There's no free lunch. Healthcare is extremely expensive. If you want universal childcare, it's expensive too, but at the same time, it can actually bring a higher labor market participation, which will have positive fiscal impact. So we should not just see social spending as something that is negative, that is a burden. We should see it in some cases as an investment, put a positive, I think, spin on it because it's actually positive and it can have really a positive economic impact in the long run, but also in addition to see some of the social spending as investment, we also have to think about tax fairness and the need to, if you spend more, to raise more money especially after the crisis is over, in a way that is sustainable and in a way that is just. And that is a major debate that we need to have in this country.
Let me combine two questions that have come from the audience that I think flow from this conversation that we've just had on sort of the politics around keeping the deficits and whatnot. There are two questions that I'm going to merge together, and one is about the revenue side, and the question is, should we be thinking about privatization, so selling off some further public assets, whether the examples given here are the mail system, rail service, airports? Should that be considered as for one avenue for raising revenues? And the other side is, don't we also have to pay attention to government expenditures? So in addition to raising some revenues, should governments also be taking this opportunity to do an expenditure review to reduce costs and deadweight loss? Robin, can I ask you to begin, and then Danielle to respond?
Well, I don't think of privatization as being a tax reform issue, actually. I think privatization is really an ownership and efficiency issue. And to the extent that it raises revenue, it's a once-over thing. Although I suppose if you're privatizing an operation which is being run on subsidies, then you save the subsidies in the future. But I mean, the issue of privatization to me is one that's is quite separate from the issue of tax reform. And I think that whether or not certain things should be owned by the government or run by the government, as opposed to being owned by and run by private individuals, is really just a question of whether you think that institution is one that should stand on its own legs, or one that should that is inevitably fulfilling a social function that it needs to get some public support. I mean, the archetypical example, I suppose you could think of, is the post office. And should we think that the post office has to stand on its own legs, or should we think that it's fulfilling a social service that that deserves some public support? I mean, we might say the same thing, by the way, about internet access in rural areas. Should that be viewed as a public service? In which case, you wouldn't expect private companies to provide that kind of service for free. So that naturally, there's some government service involved. So I think the issue of privatization is a nuanced one that involves a little bit more than simply looking at whether it's going to raise revenues. Of course, the other question you asked is whether expenditure review should be ongoing. And I think, I mean, you know more about this than I do, I think, but I would have thought that expenditure reviews were going on all the time. I have to say, I should be careful what I say here, since this is a university-run operation. I mean, if I look at the way universities run their businesses, I could probably come up with lots of ways of cutting back expenditures in universities. So maybe there are ways of cutting back expenditures in government as well. But I think really, in looking at efficiencies in government, the real question is let's look at whether the things that governments are doing are things that they should be doing, as opposed to whether what they're doing in the most cost-effective way.
Danielle?
And I think it's often, usually when you talk about finding government efficiencies, it's at least partly code for saying, let's cut back what governments are doing.
Danielle, what are your thoughts on these two avenues? Should they be part of the basket looking ahead?
Yeah, well, privatization, I'm like Robin, I'm a bit skeptical that this is actually a silver bullet from a fiscal standpoint. I think that we need quality public services, and having a fire sale to get rid of some crown corporations, or just because we think it might be good in terms of reducing the debt in the long run, I think it's is not a good idea. Regarding expenditure review, of course, we are doing this, and we need to do it in a systematic way. But again, we have also to think about how to have a review of our tax system. And so it's good to think about the expenditure side and how we can save money, or at least invest money in a more effective way. And there are certainly some programs that can be reviewed, but I don't think that you know, people say there is waste and fat and so forth. But if you look very carefully, there is probably not as much as some people believe in terms of, you know, things that could be eliminated without much of a social or economic cost. So we have to be careful what we wish for here. But I do think that this second avenue is something that we should always do. Look at how we spend and how we can spend in a way that is more effective. Now, I think we'll have to really draw lessons from COVID-19, and we have spent a lot of money really fast. And I think it was a good thing, at least in the short run, to spend a lot. It's old, you know, kind of Keynesian approach to prime the pump and spend a lot when things go down the drain, and they went down the drain really fast. But I think now we need to pause and look back at what we've done and draw lessons for also when we prepare for the next crisis or the next wave of that crisis, and see, so do the policy learning in a very active way and quite rapidly, which often actually takes sometimes years and years to know whether programs work or not. But now we live in an accelerated political and social time in a way because of this crisis, and we need to think really rapidly and evaluate all these emergency programs and to think about, well, should we do the same thing next time around, and we should find better ways to address these issues of unemployment and health crisis. And I think that there's a lot of things we can learn from the current crisis. And I think that we should start learning now and not wait until all is over, because the next crisis could happen very soon thereafter, right? We don't know. And this uncertainty forces us to be very creative and to really think at all the different to be imaginative and think about outside of the box in terms of spending, but also in terms of revenue raising. And I think we have to think about revenue raising, fiscal extraction. This is at the modern state is based on taxation. Charles Tilly and others historians have written about this, and we need to understand that you know, there is a former Supreme Court, I think a US Supreme Court judge, who said, you know, taxation is the price we pay for a civilized society. This is something that we need to keep in mind. And of course, nobody or few people like to pay taxes, but we need some pedagogy too, to say, well, if you want all of this, you will probably need to pay more taxes. Of course, there are some economic boundaries and factors we have to take into account when we think about, you know, how much we want to raise tax levels on specific constituencies and so forth. And Robin can tell us more about this. But I think that thinking about fiscal fairness and thinking about a redistribution, and how the redistribution is not just about you know, social programs, but also about the tax system. But beyond redistribution, it's just that we need money. We need more money. We need to find money. So it's not just about redistribution per se, but about having enough fuel to run the big and bigger boats that we have.
Can I just put one quick comment?
Sure.
When you back to the expenditure review question, one thing we should bear in mind when we're talking about expenditure review at the federal level is that a very high proportion of federal expenditures are actually transfers. And so when we're talking about expenditure review, we're saying, are these transfers going to the right people? And I think that's really an immensely important issue. And it's also one that's closely related to the tax reform question. Are we getting enough taxes from the right people? Are we making the right transfers to the right people? And I think in terms of fairness, both sides are important.
I agree.
Good point. I'm just conscious of how much time we have remaining, and I want to make sure that that we have enough time to cover, I think, 2 last questions. And so far, our conversation today has focused on fiscal federalism as a predominantly a federal provincial issue, right? We've actually had, I think, a really robust discussion of issues around governance and the politics of it, and areas of inequality. As well as some very, I think, thought-provoking avenues for policy reform. But what about Indigenous Canadians in the spirit of reconciliation and nation-to-nation relationships? You know, Indigenous communities on reserve came into this crisis with pretty unique challenges. There's some evidence that urban Indigenous communities have been particularly hard hit by both the health as well as the economic effects of COVID. So in the broader discussion of fiscal arrangements, where do you see Indigenous Canadians in the future of fiscal arrangements in Canada? Robin, I'll let you begin, and then Danielle.
This is a very challenging question, and I think inevitably, if we're talking about fiscal arrangements for First Nations, we're talking about fiscal arrangements that are designed to be nation-to-nation arrangements between the federal government and the First Nations. They're not things that are going to come into the rubric of equalization, CHST, and tax collection or anything like that, because First Nations are very unique. Many of them are very small, many of them are very poor. They have very little fiscal capacity, virtually zero revenue raising capacity. They have a dramatic shortage of public services. And dealing with those issues is not something that you can talk about in terms of the kind of grammar that we use in fiscal federalism of, decentralization versus centralization. Give them the money and let them do what they want to do. I think the issues of fiscal federalism applying to First Nations are really challenging, and they involve, at the basis, they involve self-governance issues. They involve issues of how do you get resources to the First Nations in a way that meets their needs and that is based on a kind of a consensual relationship. I don't have the answers. I think that's a completely separate topic from federal provincial fiscal relations, or municipal relations for that matter, quite separate.
True. It was just another area that we didn't get to touch on just yet. Danielle, can I invite you to join in?
I think it's a crucial area. Of course, Robin mentioned self-government. I think you cannot have self-government if you don't have sustainable fiscal resources to make that government actually be, that government effective in a way, and be able to tackle policy issues and be more than something purely symbolic. So money is crucial, and we will have to find a way, first of all, to help indigenous communities to further develop their economic resources to create more wealth that they will then be able to tax for their own purposes. But we also need, of course, better fiscal transfers from the federal government to indigenous communities. But we also need to think about the role of the provinces in that area. Because it's an issue that that is quite central in because so many, for example, First Nation people, they live out of reserve and in large cities and so forth. So the provinces also play a major role here. And so I think that this issue will require a lot of dialogue, and it's not just about the federal government versus indigenous peoples. I think that we have to bring, the territories, of course, but also the municipalities, and it's very important, the provinces to the table when we talk about this.
Actually, maybe let's just try and squeeze in a discussion here of municipalities, because it is another dimension we haven't been able to touch on yet. Is it time for municipalities to see some expansion in their revenue raising capacity? Danielle, why don't I actually begin with you this time, and followed by Robin.
I do think it's time for municipalities to increase their fiscal capacity. The problem, of course, is that it raises issues with provincial governments and internal tensions within each province. So there's also, of course, transfers regarding and money for infrastructure, for example. A lot of this money goes to, is used within large cities, for example. So there are a lot of issues to be tackled in terms of the fiscal capacity of municipalities, so their capacity to raise revenues, but also fiscal federalism as it involves the federal government, the provinces, and the municipalities, and how they can work together to deliver to help municipalities deliver the important services that citizens need. And I think that we are way behind here in Canada in terms of thinking about the role of municipalities within fiscal federalism. This is in part because of constitutional design and the way our institutions are set up. But I think we can learn a lot from other countries where municipalities play a more central role in social policy and have more political clout nationally, and also a stronger voice and more fiscal capacity. So I think all these issues are linked, in my opinion. Political clout, status within the federation and money and where the money comes from, how you can extract more money at the municipal level, but also how we can have better transfers that will help municipalities, especially large cities, which are facing tremendous challenges right now, which have been exacerbated by COVID-19, issues of public transportation, where losing a lot of money because way fewer people ride. So if it's as a source of revenue, this has declined a lot. So big cities are really facing big challenges, and that should be, I think, an issue central to future debates about fiscal federalism.
Robin, what are your thoughts on fiscal capacity at the municipal
I agree
level?
with pretty well everything that Danielle said. I think that we shouldn't underestimate. It's important to get more revenue raising to the municipalities, and no doubt about that. They're facing fiscal. Before the pandemic, they were facing fiscal crises in terms of keeping up with their provision of services and infrastructure, and they're be forced to rely on increasingly on property taxes, including business property taxes, which have become probably too large. But how to get revenue raising to municipalities is not a real trivial thing, because they're very different in size, and how do you sort of decide which municipalities are going to have their own sales taxes as opposed to income taxes, and how do you deal with the competition that's going to rise between municipalities? I mean, to me, I can't see any solution other than having more robust system of transfers between the provinces and the municipalities, and possibly involving the federal government when it comes to infrastructure. So, many dimensions have to be done at the same time. Sorry, that's not much of an answer.
But it's an honest one in terms of the complexity of the challenge in front of us. We have time for one final question, and this one is from an audience member, and I think it is a really nice note to end on. So governments have promised to, quote, build back better. In achieving that aim, and I'm going to let you use your imagination as to your personal definition of what better means, but will federal-provincial fiscal relationships be a major constraint on achieving that goal? Or do you think that the real constraint actually lies someplace else, and that if governments are committed to building back better, they'll figure out some sort of federal-provincial arrangement? So we just have a few moments left, so I'll invite you both to give your views on this. And again, maybe this time we'll begin with you, Danielle, and then followed by Robin.
Yes, I think there are challenges that are inherent to fiscal federalism, and I mentioned some of them before: political challenges and fiscal challenges, that economic challenges that Robin discussed. I still think that what happened during this crisis gives me some hope, because there was a high level of collaboration between Ottawa and the provinces. And when people need to collaborate in times of crisis, it seems that we're able to do it. A much more effective response to the crisis fiscally and in terms of social policy than what we saw in other federal countries like the United States or Brazil. So maybe we should draw some political lessons from the crisis we faced as well, and maybe try to keep some of this spirit alive by considering the urgency of the fiscal challenges we face. So I think that there are obstacles, there are challenges, but there are also opportunities to build a more effective fiscal federal system in Canada.
Robin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think fiscal federalism I would never view as a constraint on building better, because necessarily both the federal government and the provinces have responsibilities that are crucial in terms of making a better society. And I think the only way we can go forward is if we have a federal provincial system which recognizes the responsibilities of each level of government, but recognizes their joint responsibilities to, what you might think of as social solidarity or the social contract, and making the social union and the economic union function as well as possible. And that, to me, involves both the federal government and the provinces, plus cooperation and harmonization that's necessary to achieve it.
We're out of time, unfortunately. I would love to continue this conversation. It's been wide-ranging, very thought-provoking, and I wish that we had an opportunity to give you both applause. So please accept my personal thanks on behalf of the rest of the audience. It's been just a wonderful conversation, very, very thought-provoking, as I said. But now I think I have to turn the microphone back over to Keith Banting.
Well, I want to add my thanks to, excuse me, to Jennifer's, to our speakers, but I'd also like to thank Jennifer for being such a thoughtful and elegant moderator for the session. It's been stimulating, it's been fun, it's been interesting. The conference will resume tomorrow, and with a timely session on rethinking the social contract. So throughout this series of sessions, we have debated many possibilities for improving, for building back better. And this week we are looking at the preconditions or the sources of support for doing so. Tomorrow, we're going to talk directly about the prospects for rethinking the social contract in Canada. We are living through, in the pandemic, a context where we see the divisions in terms of economic inequality much more clearly. The pandemic has raised them. But the pandemic has also shone light on issues of racial inequality, the extent to which people of color in various communities have borne a disproportionate burden during this pandemic. And so tomorrow, we're going to take these two big issues, economic inequality, racial inequality, the linkages between them, and we're going to ask the question, can we do better? What are the sources of support for making progress on either or both of these big agendas? And what are the sources of resistance? What are the constraints? What are the barriers to change? Can we rethink the social contract in Canada? And to help us have that conversation, we have three great speakers for you. The first speaker is Irene Bloomrad, who is the Thomas Garden Baines Chair of Canadian Studies and Director of the Institute for I'm doing a mess of this, interdisciplinary migration at the University of California at Berkeley. Irene is a Canadian who has been at Berkeley for a long period of time, strong interests in the issues of citizenship and social integration, and particular interest in immigration and its relationships to the social contract. And so she will be a great contributor. Our second speaker will be Hugh Siegel. Hugh is well known to you all, so I won't say more than that he's now the Matthews Fellow in Global Public Policy at the School of Policy Studies at Queen's. And he has, as you probably all know, had a long-standing interest in a guaranteed income and the issues of poverty and inequality in Canada. And our third speaker will be Deborah Thompson. Deborah is a newly appointed associate professor at McGill University, who spent the first part of her career at various universities in the United States, and is a scholar who is focused on issues of race and racial injustice in Canada and the United States. And so she will confront these issues and bring them to the table most forcefully. So I think we're going to have a great conversation about the prospects for rethinking the social contract in Canada, and about the sort of prospects for progress on these two big inequality agendas. So I really hope you can join us. Please use your unique URL, the one that you used to join us today and that you've been using for all of these sessions. And before closing, I would like to once again acknowledge and thank our sponsors, Employment and Social Development Canada, the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services in Ontario, and the City of Toronto. Without their support, we would not be able to bring together this very rich banquet of speakers and discussions. So, until tomorrow, stay safe and join us. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.